September 1944, Eastern France. Rain on canvas. A radio hissing static into the dark. Inside a command tent lit by a single bulb that swings slowly with the wind, 6 men stand around a map. The map is marked in red and blue grease pencil. The red is moving, the blue is not. A message has just come in. It traveled down the chain from 12th Army Group, through 3rd Army Headquarters, through Corps, and finally onto this folding table. The paper is still warm from the radio operator's hands. The order is simple. Pull back. Conserve fuel. Hold a defensive line. Wait. The general reads it once. He reads it again. He sets it down on the map, exactly where his forward tanks are dug into the wheat fields east of a French village no one in America has ever heard of. He does not raise his voice. He does not raise his voice. He does not curse. He does not look up. He says 4 words. We're staying right here. The tent goes silent. A captain stops writing. A colonel stops breathing. Somewhere outside, a sergeant lights a cigarette and forgets to inhale. Every man in that tent understands what just happened. An order from Patton has been refused, not delayed, not questioned, refused. By the time the sun comes up, this general's career will almost certainly be over. What none of them know, not the captain, not the colonel, not the general himself, is that 40 miles to the east, in the wet darkness of a Lorraine forest, the engines of 3 German Panther brigades have already started turning. Hundreds of brand new tanks. Thousands of men. A counterattack Berlin believes will change the war in the West. They are driving straight toward this tent. They are driving straight into a trap they cannot see. And the man who refused to run is the only one who knows it is there. To understand what happened in those wheat fields, you have to understand what had already gone wrong. 2 months earlier, the 3rd United States Army had been the wonder of the war. Patton's tanks tore across France like something out of a fever dream. Towns liberated in hours. German divisions cut off and surrendered by the thousand. The newspapers back home printed maps with arrows that seemed to grow longer every morning. Then, in early September, the arrows stopped. Not because of the Germans, because of gasoline. Eisenhower had made a decision. The supplies, the fuel, the ammunition, the trucks, would go north, to Montgomery, to the push toward Antwerp and the Rhine. Patton would be left to scrape by on whatever was left in the bottom of the cans. The men of the 3rd Army felt it before headquarters admitted it. Tanks coasted into villages in neutral. Crews siphoned fuel from captured German vehicles. Patrols went out on foot because there was nothing left to put in the jeeps. And out at the very tip of that bleeding spear, dug into a thin line east of Nancy, sat the 4th Armored Division. Exhausted, exposed, strung out across miles of farmland with no reserves behind them and a fog-shrouded forest in front. The Germans had been watching. For weeks they had watched the American advance slow, then stutter, then stop. They watched the supply trucks turn north. They watched the patrols thin out. And in a chateau outside Berlin, a man with shaking hands traced a finger across a map and saw the opening he had been praying for. The Americans, he believed, were about to be taught a lesson. His name was John Shirley Wood. The men called him P. The P stood for professor. He had earned it at West Point, where he tutored half his classmates through their exams and graduated near the top in 1912. He spoke French. He read philosophy. He kept a battered copy of the Roman historian Tacitus in his footlocker and sometimes quoted it to his staff when he thought no one was listening. He had been a football star once. Big shoulders. Quiet eyes. The kind of man who never had to raise his voice in a locker room because everyone already wanted to do what he asked. He was 56 years old in September of 1944. He commanded a 4th Armored Division, and the men in that division did not just respect him, they loved him. Wood did not ride in the back. He drove forward in a jeep, often without an escort, and he stopped to talk to privates by name. He remembered where they were from. He remembered if their mother had been sick in the last letter. When a tank crew lost a friend, Wood was sometimes there before the chaplain. Patton, who was not generous with praise, had quietly called him the Rommel of the American Army. Almost no one outside the division knew his name. That is how Wood liked it. On the night the order came in to pull back, he was wearing a wool sweater under his field jacket, because the tent was cold and he hated the cold. He had just finished a letter to his wife. He had not yet sealed it. He read the order. He set it down. He looked at his operations officer, a young colonel named Bruce Clark, and what passed between them in that look was a conversation that did not need words. Clark had been working on something. Wood knew it. Wood had been letting him. Bruce Cooper Clark was 33 years old, an engineer by training, a combat commander by accident. He had grown up poor in upstate New York. He had worked his way through enlisted ranks before earning a commission. He did not look like a tank officer. He looked like a man who built bridges, which, in a sense, he was. He built things in his head. He laid them out in lines and angles and arcs of fire, and when he was done, you could not see what he had built until the enemy was already inside it. For 5 days, Clark had been studying the ground east of Aracourt. He had walked it, driven it, climbed the low hills and crouched in the wheat. He had noted where the fog gathered in the mornings and where it burned off first. He had marked the sunken roads that funneled vehicles into narrow lanes. He had watched how the rolling hills hid the silhouette of a Sherman from anyone approaching from the east. The American Sherman tank in 1944 was a problem. Its 75mm gun could not punch through the frontal armor of the new German Panther. Everyone in the division knew it. Every crew lived with it. But Clark had noticed something. He had measured it. He had thought about it for a long time. If you could force a Panther to turn, if you could make it expose its flank, even for a few seconds, at close range, the Sherman could kill it. Easily. From 300 yards. From 200. From 100. You just had to make the Panther turn. The wheat fields and rolling hills around Aracourt were almost perfectly designed for that. The terrain forced any attacker coming from the east to swing south around a ridge, exposing their flanks to anyone hidden along the woodline to the north. Clark had been quietly placing his tanks along that woodline for 2 days. He had not told Corps. He had not told Army. He had told Wood. And Wood had nodded once and said, "Keep going." 500 miles east, in a bunker that smelled of damp concrete and old cigarette smoke, Adolf Hitler bent over a map of Lorraine. He had not slept. He rarely slept now. His left hand trembled, and he kept it pressed against his thigh so the generals would not see. He was planning 2 counterattacks. One, the famous one, would come in December in the Ardennes. The world would remember that one. The world would call it the Battle of the Bulge. But first, there was this one, the forgotten one, the dress rehearsal. The newly formed 5th Panzer Army had been built in secret. Brand new Panther tanks, fresh off the assembly lines, painted in factory primer, their crews barely trained. Free Panzer brigades, the 111th, the 112th, the 113th, were to drive west from the Lorraine forests, smash into the exposed flank of Patton's Third Army, and race for the Moselle River. The plan, on paper, was beautiful. Hundreds of tanks. Surprise. Fog. An American division that was low on fuel and stretched thin. What the plan did not account for was that the crews had never fired their guns in combat, that the brigade commanders had never worked together, that the radios in the new Panthers did not always reach the radios in the supporting infantry, and it did not account for 2 American officers neither Hitler nor his generals had ever heard of. The orders went out on the night of September 18. By midnight, the engines were running. Dawn, September 19, 1944. The fog came in the way it always does in Lorraine in September. Thick, white, soundless, smelling of wet earth and apples from the orchards. A man could not see his own hand at the end of his arm. The American crews were waking up. Coffee was boiling on the back decks of Shermans. Crews were eating cold rations, standing up, blowing on their fingers. Somewhere, a radio operator was telling a joke about his mother-in-law. Somewhere, a sergeant was complaining that his socks were wet again. Out of the white wall, with no warning, came a sound. Not an engine. The fog distorted engines. A shape. A long, low silhouette. The unmistakable sloped glacis of a Panther, looming out of nothing, no more than 100 yards from the lead American tank. The first shot of the Battle of Aracourt was fired at a range so close the gunners did not need their sights. A young American gunner, Private First Class Donald Guild, 22 years old, from a farm outside Marietta, Ohio, fired before his commander finished the order. The Panther's turret jumped. Black smoke poured from its hatches. A crewman scrambled out, his uniform on fire, and disappeared back into the fog. Then another shape, then another. The Panthers were everywhere, and so were the Americans. The two armored forces had blundered into each other in the white blindness, and the fight that followed had no front, no flanks, no order. Tanks fired at muzzle flashes. Crews mistook their own vehicles for the enemy. A lieutenant from Pennsylvania, 23 years old, who had lied about his age to enlist in 1941, climbed onto the back of a burning Panther to pull a wounded German crewman out, and then crawled back to his own tank with a bullet in his shoulder he did not feel until that night. It should have been a slaughter. It should have been an American disaster. It was not, because of what Clark had built. As the fog began to thin, the shape of the battlefield began to reveal itself. And so did the shape of the trap. The Panthers, coming from the east, had been funneled by the terrain exactly as Clark had predicted. The ridge south of Ericourt had forced them to swing. The wheat fields had channeled them into a narrow corridor. And along the woodline to the north, hull down, almost invisible in the morning haze, sat the Shermans of the 4th Armored Division. Side on, at 300 yards. The first volley took out 7 Panthers in under a minute. The Germans tried to turn. Turning made it worse. Every rotation of those long German turrets exposed more flank armor to American gunners who had been waiting for this exact moment for 2 days. American tank destroyers, the long-barreled Me-18 Hellcats, fast and lightly armored, came roaring out of the tree lines, firing on the move. Artillery batteries that Clark had pre-registered on the wheat fields opened up with timed airbursts that shredded the German infantry trying to keep pace with their tanks. A German lieutenant, climbing out of a burning Panther, would later tell his American interrogators that he never saw the tank that killed him. He only heard it. A single dry crack from somewhere in the trees to his left. By mid-morning, the wheat fields east of Ericourt were burning. By noon, the German brigade commander had lost a third of his tanks and could not raise 2 of his battalions on the radio. By nightfall, he had lost more than half. And it was in the middle of this, with the battle still raging, with Panthers still burning in the fields, that the order came down from above. Pull back. Conserve fuel. Hold defensive line. The radio operator who took the message looked at it for a long moment before he carried it into the tent. Wood read it under the swinging bulb. The rain had started again. The canvas above his head sagged with water. Bruce Clark was standing across the table, mud halfway up his trousers, having just come in from the forward positions. His eyes were red. He had not slept in 2 nights. Wood read the order a second time. Then he set it down, flat, exactly on the spot where Clark's forward tanks were dug in. We're staying right here. That was all. Clark did not smile. He did not nod. He simply turned and walked back out into the rain, because he had work to do, and because he had known, somehow, that this was what Wood was going to say. Behind him, a colonel sat down slowly on a folding stool. A captain reached for a cigarette and forgot to light it. A young lieutenant, a runner from Corps headquarters who had personally carried the order forward, stood frozen in the corner of the tent, his mouth slightly open. He was 24 years old. He would tell the story for the rest of his life, and he would never tell it the same way twice, because he could never quite explain what he had felt in that moment. Patton arrived the next morning. He came in his command jeep, with the 3 stars on the bumper and the ivory-handled revolvers on his belt that the newsreels loved so much. Wood was waiting for him outside the tent. The 2 men had known each other for 30 years. They had served together at Fort Benning before the war. Patton had personally requested Wood for the 4th Armored. He had watched Wood race across France faster than any division commander in American history. He also knew that Wood had refused his order. They went inside, just the 2 of them. The staff stepped out into the wet morning and pretended to look at maps spread across the hood of a jeep. What was said in that tent was never fully recorded. Wood never wrote it down. Patton mentioned it only once, in passing, in a letter to his wife. But the men who stood outside, close enough to catch fragments through the canvas, remembered it as the quietest argument they had ever almost heard. No shouting, no table pounding, just 2 voices, low and even, going back and forth for perhaps 10 minutes. and then a pause, a long one, and then Patton, walking back out into the daylight, putting his helmet on, looking at the staff officers gathered awkwardly around the jeep and saying, to no one in particular, almost to himself, he was right. He climbed into his jeep. He drove away. The order to withdraw was never enforced. The Battle of Aricourt did not end in a single day. For 4 more days, the Germans came on. Fresh brigades. New attacks. The fog returned on the morning of the 22nd, and they tried again. And again the wheat fields swallowed them. By the time it was over, the newly formed 5th Panzer Army had lost more than 200 tanks. The 4th Armored Division had lost 25, 200 to 25. It was one of the most lopsided armored victories of the entire war in Europe. The greatest German armored counterattack in the West before the Ardennes had been broken, not by overwhelming force, not by air power, not by numerical superiority, but by terrain, by preparation, and by a quiet sentence spoken in a wet tent under a swinging bulb. Berlin did not understand what had happened. The reports that reached Hitler's bunker were vague, contradictory, incomplete. 3 brigades had been committed. Most of them had not come back. The men who did return spoke of fog, and of Shermans that appeared out of tree lines, and of a battlefield that seemed to have been prepared for them before they ever arrived. The dress rehearsal for the Ardennes had failed. In 3 months, Hitler would try again, further north, in a forest called the Ardennes, and the world would remember that one forever. Aricourt, he would never speak of again. There was no parade. There were no headlines. The American newspapers that autumn were full of other things: the liberation of Brussels, the airborne disaster at Arnhem, the slow grinding push toward the German border. A tank battle in the wheat fields of Lorraine, won by a division most Americans had never heard of, commanded by a general most Americans could not name, did not make the front pages. Wood did not seek headlines. He had never sought them. 3 months later, in the bitter cold of December, as the Ardennes exploded and the world's attention turned north, John Shirley Wood was quietly relieved of his command. The official reason was exhaustion. The unofficial reason, the one his fellow officers whispered about for years afterward, was different. He was too independent, too quiet, too willing to ignore orders he believed were wrong. He had won, but he had won the wrong way, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and he had embarrassed people who did not like being embarrassed. Patton fought to keep him. Patton lost. Wood went home before the war ended. He watched the final victory from a desk in the United States. He never commanded troops in combat again. Bruce Clark went on to other battles, including, 3 months later, a small Belgian town called Saint-Vith, where he would once again hold a position he had been ordered to abandon and once again be proven right. He would end his career as a 4-star general. The wheat fields east of Aricourt were replanted in the spring of 1945. The burned hulls of the Panthers were dragged away for scrap. The farmers came back. The village returned to what it had been for 1,000 years before the war, a quiet place where almost nothing ever happened. Years later, long after the war, long after the medals had been pinned and the parades had ended for other men, John Shirley Wood walked alone through a field in Lorraine. He was an old man by then. His shoulders had narrowed. His hair was white. He carried a cane he did not really need. He had come back, quietly, with no entourage and no press. He had taken a train from Paris and a taxi from the station, and he had asked the driver to leave him at the edge of the wheat. He stood there for a long time. In his coat pocket was a letter. It had arrived a few months earlier from a man named Donald Guild, the young gunner from Ohio who had fired the first shot out of the fog on that September morning. Guild was a grandfather now. He had written to tell the general that his eldest grandson had just been born. The boy's name was John. Wood read the letter once, standing in the field. He folded it carefully. He put it back in his pocket. He looked out across the wheat, which was the same wheat, more or less, that had grown there before the tanks came and burned it black. He did not say anything. There was no one to say it to. After a while, he walked back to the road. History remembers the loud men, the ones with ivory revolvers and quotable lines and biographers waiting at the door. It remembers the generals who shouted in tents and the commanders who posed for cameras. It does not always remember the quiet ones. The ones who stood in a wet tent under a swinging bulb and said 4 words that no one expected and then went back to work, and then went home, and then walked alone in a field many years later, carrying a letter about a boy named John. But the wheat remembers. The wheat remembers everything. If you had been standing in that tent, if the order had come down and every voice of authority above you had told you to step back, would you have had the courage to say the 4 words that ended a career and saved an army? Or would you have folded the paper and obeyed?